what good is a box, a fancy little box, a little enclave, if your data can't fit inside of it? So that's the first question that we always ask. And to be honest, if any of you have ever asked that question internally, and again, technical people probably don't typically know what CUI is, to be honest, right? If they ask it internal to executives or the BD team or whatever it might be, they might say, well, we don't know. It's probably everywhere, right? It's in my email. It's in our ERP system. It's in our financial system. It's on Joe's MacBook Pro that he keeps lugging around, right? It's on all these different devices. And so when IT people come to us for a solution, because they're always the ones that tend to be tasked with this, even though it's way more than just an IT issue, they're like, we speak in solutions, right? We speak in technical configurations. It's what we do, right? Change control, we understand. Conditional access policies, we understand. Active Directory, we love Active Directory. But identifying data, that is a company-wide problem, right? So what is controlled unclassified information is the first question that we always like to ask, right? And this is taken right off a Govy website. It's CUI is government-created or owned information that requires safeguarding or dissemination controls consistent with applicable laws, regulations, and government-wide policies, right? That's the fun definition of what CUI is in the context of what we're talking about today. Now, the question that we get all the time is, Daniel, how do I know what kind of CUI I have, right? It's like, we have this word out there, and it just says CUI, but little known fact, there's a lot of kind of interpretations and definitions of CUI that NARA has, right? So NARA, the National Archives, has a government-wide CUI program. The one that you're probably more intimately familiar with is even the DoD CUI program, right? So we're all pulling on these things. Those go to the contracting officer, right? So we heard her speak today about identifying contract clauses and CUI potentially on contracts. Those go to me, the prime in this situation, right? Big acronym. And I'm supposed to articulate that to the subcontractors. Now, I'm surprised I didn't get a lot of laughs out of this because nobody, the contracting officer included, tends to actually know what CUI is. They just say, hey, I've talked to procurement all the time, right? Procurement people. They're like, I've escalated my prime, or the prime's escalated to the KO, and they're like, every time we ask if it's CUI, guess what they say? Of course it is. Why wouldn't it be? Everything is CUI, right? Everything we give you is CUI, right? Every document, every email. Some of the great stories I hear are, a buddy of mine asked to go play golf, right? He works on site somewhere. He sent me an email, and it had, this message is considered controlled unclassified information, right? And it's like that kind of stuff. It's like, first off, there's the wonderful problem of overclassification that the DoD has. Which no one tends to be fixing, at least right now. And so we have to deal with the brunt of everything could potentially be CUI, right? Because every time we escalate or every email we get always has this banner on it or some kind of terminology that indicates that it might be. But this is the kind of the way that it should flow, right? You should be able to ask your contracting officer. They're going to say yes. Then you got to pass that information back down to your supply chain. So the question that follows that after what kind of CUI do I have is, well, where the heck is it, right? So now you got the executives asking IT, find our CUI. Well, you got yourself, looking again, and you're like, okay, I guess we got to do this thing, right? So one of the interesting things in doing these exercises, and many people in the audience can probably attest to this, is that when IT is asked to do something, IT typically finds a technical solution to do the job, right? When you're talking about data flow, specifically CUI data flow, you really need to assess the workflows of the people to start, right? Now, technologies are great, and I love technology, and we'll talk about how you can do some of that stuff a little bit later. But interviewing these people, right? Sales, procurement, quality assurance, looks a little shady. Accounting up there on the far right. These are the people that we need to understand, where is this data coming in, right? What are the ingestion points of this data? Where is this data being sent, right? Where's it going? Because technology is great, and there's a ton of different platforms out there, whether you're in Office 365 or G Suite or whatever it might be. Now, obviously, there's some compliance concerns depending. But there's great tools out there. But unless you know where the data is actually going in your organization and you ask these questions, you're not going to be able to find the answer with just technology. Now, I use this illustration in a lot of my sales calls where, we have an email come in with an attachment that has CUI in it. That goes into your cloud provider. That syncs to your devices. That's on a network. Maybe you got to print it. Goes into our ERP system out there with Daryl. Goes into a file server. Oh, USB, that's still around somewhere, right? Maybe you're using third-party collaboration services. Maybe you're backing up your mobile devices with that CUI on it. And maybe you don't know any of this, right? There's this wonderful term that you end up probably loving and hating called shadow IT, right? You have your users out there doing all sorts of bonkers stuff. I mean, the stories that we could probably tell each other about that are probably very, very long, and I would happily do that tonight. But what you realize is you can't control all of the different points, right, of ingestion typically, or even where the data is actually being sent, unless you have a very fine-tuned not only compliance policy, but also a good security posture, right? Unless you're monitoring a lot of these things in real time. And so it starts with the people, understanding where all the points are to start, and then you can overlay technology with network diagrams and different cloud services and whatever you might be using, and that'll give you a good idea and understanding of not only the flow, but also the asset inventory you need to start taking, right? And these assets, you can go through the classification of CUI assets and contractor risk managed assets and SPAs and all of those wonderful things that are under CMMC. But you have to start somewhere. My recommendation, and I know this is hard for IT people, start with the people, right? They're typically going to be your best bet to go with. Now, because again, I'm a big, this is my fun slide. IT cannot be solely responsible for identifying CUI data flow in the organization. Most of the time, again, IT gets the hat, right? You guys are the ones, right? It's your problem. Compliance is your problem, right? You're like, no, IT is my problem, right? Compliance is not. But this is to go out to every executive that I could preach to, if there's any in this room, is that IT cannot be left holding the bag with this. They just can't. They don't have the resources. They get 2% of your budget a year to actually do IT things, let alone compliance things, and they just need more help. They need executive buy-in. And supporting your IT will actually end up growing the revenue of the company, right? If you position yourself to do CMMC and do it well and right, then now the market opens pretty dramatically for you come over the next few years. And so my recommendation, if you're an executive in this place, buy your IT person or IT team a steak dinner, take them out saying, let's talk about your budget, let's talk about your staffing, let's figure out how we can actually do this together, right? Because this is a together problem, not an IT problem. So when we're talking about technologies to use and where to start with the identification of CUI from a technology platform, Office 365, Microsoft 365, whatever they want to call it today, this is a great tool to use. Have any of you guys used content searches in Office 365 before, right? So it's a kind of an e-discovery type tool. An interesting story about this, I was talking to a company that said, all of our ITAR data is kept on-prem in an isolated SharePoint instance, tucked away, right? Behind, segmented, logically, they probably would have even gone and said physically separated from everything. Well, I said, okay, pop open content search, do a little search for different criteria, right? CUI, and ITAR, export control. And for a 200-person company, they came back with 3,800 unique records of CUI and ITAR in their environment. Now, if you say 50% of those are just kind of garbage, maybe they don't actually mean anything, that's still 1,000 of different types of objects that are inside of their Microsoft tenant, right? And this is a great tool because you can quickly show your executive team, hey, CUI is actually everywhere. Joe's got it, Susie's got it, Stacy's got it. It's everywhere, right? So we need to do one of two things. We need to identify these people, and these need to be part of our enclave, right? These need to be part of our new boundary for compliance. Or we need to reconsider maybe not doing an enclave at all at this point, right? Because we can't control the flow because all of these people double dip, right? Maybe they do commercial work and federal work. Maybe you can't hire, or an enclave doesn't make a lot of practical sense, which we'll get to in a second. But this is a good kind of initial point, if you're an IT person, to validate if an enclave might be a good solution just from a pure technological standpoint. So much so that we wrote a blog about it. So I know some of you are probably QR code hesitant, so I put the link in the bottom as well. But this is a blog that Jason Sprosser on our team wrote. That just walks you through how to actually search and what kind of criteria to search inside of Office 365 to get a good founding idea, right? What mailboxes have it, what SharePoint sites, Team sites, OneDrive, all the things you may or may not actually know about. So highly recommend taking a read on that. It's been very valuable. We've used it a few times already, and it's brought a lot of good results, right? So after we identify the CUI, which is one of the hardest things that you can do in an organization, the next question that we have to ask is, does an enclave actually meet our business needs, right? So we've got our CUI, we've identified it. Next up, can our business function if we actually segment things, right? The fun little collaboration over there and business intelligence. These are the two most asked about items when we talk about doing enclave implementations, because they need the collaboration to work with other companies, right? Other teams, potentially. If they're multinational, they have multiple instances spun up kind of all over the world. How do we collaborate still to move the ball forward and not prohibit business from actually happening doing an enclave? And then business intelligence, right? How do we get the business intelligence that we need out of this? Because a lot of organizations use a single ERP system, right? And so those are kind of big problems that we'll talk about here in just a second. The first one primarily being is, can we actually even manage duplicate systems? So we have our wonderful corporate environment over there. We have our cloud CUI enclave that we have deployed over here inside of the Microsoft Gov platform. And then we have this pesky little thing called this ERP system, right? And many organizations, when they're talking about technology, they're thinking data flow in the sense of emails and files, right? They're not thinking about all of the different records, SQL databases, and all of the other unique instances that CUI can actually manifest in. And so when you're looking at this, one of the questions to ask yourself and ask your company is, can we actually duplicate systems? Because maybe ERP on the left isn't a FedRAMP cloud, right? Maybe it can't actually hold CUI, right? So that means we either have to get a new one, or hey, maybe that existing one is. Maybe we can do something else. But in a lot of cases, you might have to end up duplicating all of your business systems, which is very difficult and very expensive, right? So again, when we're talking about the lift to an enclave, we're talking about not only, the data flow and making sure that it's kind of buttoned up, but we're also making sure that we can actually manage and price out and cost out what it's going to cost to duplicate all the systems that we might need to actually have CUI inside of them. So what are your business requirements? Are users able to use multiple systems, physical or virtual? This was an interesting one. I was working with a very large electronics manufacturer, and we were talking about using virtual desktops because they wanted kind of an easier solution. And so what they found out is, after I sent them a survey, I said, hey, have your users fill out this. They had about 400 users that are going to be in their enclave. I said, have them fill out this and see how many can actually use a virtualized asset versus a physical asset. Well, we do manufacturing of electronics, right? So we need a lot of physical access to our systems, USBs or different dongles and things that they need to use for some of the systems. And so virtual desktop ended up getting ruled out very quickly for them, right? Because they found out that 80% of their workforce had some sort of need for offline access, right? Or physical ports, something to that nature. The next one that we've already talked about a little bit is, can all the required business information be retrieved or viewed in the enclave, right? Is it okay having a potential delay in gathering information that the business might deem critical, right? Instead of having to jump through a box or through a portal or a jump box, whatever it might be. This is typically overlooked. And again, IT people are typically thinking solutions, right? You are tasked with getting us CMMC compliant. And in your mind, probably a lot of times, that's a solution of some sort. But the actual business needs are typically overlooked, and that comes second after the environment's been built, when really that should be an initial consideration in a lot of ways. The next one is, do you have any technical controls preventing data from being moved to your commercial environment? I have seen this time and time again. It's great to have an enclave, but when you have an auto email forwarder set up to your commercial environment, it doesn't do a lot of good, right? I mean, I have found that more times than I can count when I actually ask and interview people. It's like, oh, we just have our, DoD contractors forward everything, auto forward all their pay stubs and, non-CUI information and potentially CUI just to their Gmail addresses, because we don't want to pay for licensing, right? And so this is a whole kind of worm that we could, or a whole little hole that we could go down. But these are just some general questions to ask, right? Not only do we have the business intelligence that we need, not only do we have the systems, duplicating the systems, is this going to be a burden that we're willing to take on if we actually do an enclave? This is one that all the IT people should actually like. Are you able to staff running multiple IT environments? One of the interesting stats that I found is Robert Half, a very large staffing agency, as you guys might know, said the average count should be about one IT support person per 70 employees, right? So that's about the count or the ratio that you should be working off of. Does that happen? Probably not. You know, I've worked in environments where they've had 2 IT people for, 200 or 300 people, right? And at scale with automation, you can maybe get that number down a little bit or up a little bit. But I did all this to kind of point out this next piece. So assuming that 10 to 20% of the time required for the following jobs for a 70-person enclave. So what I'm saying here is there's a 70-person environment that you're going to manage, right? Let's assuming it's going to take 10 to 20% of individuals' times. And here are some of the roles that you might be looking at. Sysadmin, cloud engineer, compliance officer, help desk analyst, security analyst. Here's a beautiful column with annual salaries here in the DC area. And then between 10 and 20% of their salary, if you're going to allocate that same amount of time to the actual enclave itself. So a lot of times when people are building or segmenting environments, they don't think about the overhead costs that it's actually going to take to support it. And this is, again, I don't want to talk you out of an enclave because an enclave is counterintuitive to me as a salesperson. I want to sell you enclaves all day. Love selling them. They're my best friend, right? But as someone who wants to make sure that environments are actually getting compliant, these are all considerations that you actually want to take and that your executive team should be taking, right? They should be looking at potentially adding headcount to your staff. Even though it might be the same number of users, you're now duplicating that user quantity inside of a different environment, right? And so that averages out between $45,000 to $90,000 a year, not fully loaded, right? We're not talking insurance and benefits. We're just talking salary here, right? So not only do we have the implementation costs of an enclave, potentially buying duplicate licensing for systems and software, but now we have the actual overhead of, oh, we need actually warm bodies to manage this environment. Because guess what? Most commercial environments, at least smaller businesses, they don't have change control board in their commercial space, right? That's a new thing that you're going to have to introduce as part of this, right? They don't have a developed incident response plan or any kind of security operations that are happening. Again, so you have to start introducing not only new things, but also new heads to meet those requirements that you're actually going to have. If you can even find them. So this was an article that was posted July 18th, not too long ago. White House to hold summit on addressing the thousands of unfilled cybersecurity jobs. Currently flags more than 714,000 jobs. So if you're looking, there's obviously a market out there. And the problem that people are seeing, and I think Ryan and I have talked about this a few times, if you say you have a CMMC guru in your back office, guess what? That chair's spinning because that person has gotten a new job somewhere else, making double what you're paying them today. There's so many job opportunities out there right now. So if you're going to do an enclave, you're going to staff people, make sure to not only compensate them well, but make sure that they're educated well, right? Make sure there's a path forward for them because they could easily go somewhere else. I mean, the math kind of lines up to somewhere between 80 to 300,000 plus companies in this DoD supply chain. If we're assuming for CUI handling requirements, right? So if we're assuming, one person per every DoD contractor, and that's being incredibly, it's under budget, if you will, that's still not even meeting the full amount of unfilled jobs there are today. So it's going to be robbing from Peter to pay Paul, right? They're going to come from small business ABC and go to small business XYZ, make $20,000, and every 6 months are going to get a better and better job offer. I've been out of the IT game for a couple of years, and I get LinkedIn messages every day saying, come be our director of CMMC at our company. Come implement CMMC in our business. And I'm in sales, right? I mean, they're really desperate if they're coming to me. I haven't automated something in PowerShell in a very, very long time, right? So, but that's another thing to keep a look for, I mean, just make sure that you're keeping your people happy and you're having enough of them to make sure that they don't have to work 24 hours a day to become compliant, right? One of the last bullets I have here, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail, is, do you have contracts with CUI outside of the DoD? And this is commonly overlooked. There's a wonderful thing that will eventually come out, the timetable is yet to be known, called the FAR CUI ruling. The FAR CUI ruling is going to apply CUI handling requirements at a minimum to multiple CUI across quite a few different agencies, right? There's a lot of them out there. And so when we're talking to organizations, and this is more of a kind of an insulator, protect yourself for future growth, is what other agencies are you working with outside of the DoD, right? Are you working with DOT or DOE, or some of them already have established standards and requirements for cybersecurity best practices? But just know that NIST 800-171 is going to be the baseline across all of these probably relatively shortly, right? And so if you look at 10% of our revenues from the DoD today, but 40% is from the federal government, and there are CUI requirements on some of those contracts today, or they've at least hinted that they're coming, then you might need to reassess doing an enclave. Or maybe start with an enclave, but know eventually you're going to have to grow to consolidate your whole company into that position, right? As I mentioned before, a lot of great names up here, 61 primary agencies, a ton of sub-agencies that fall into that category as well. Just make sure that you're doing due diligence, right? Again, this is not an IT problem, right? IT, you guys are doing your best. I've been there, I've been in the shoes that you guys have once been in. And you have to take a holistic business approach to this if you want to do it well and to be able to grow the company successfully. So now what, right? So you've beaten us up about why we probably shouldn't do an enclave. What do you got to say to that, right? So enclaves are a good place to start, like we mentioned, right? If you're looking for kind of a quick jump start to build an environment, starting with a small subset of people or different infrastructure, and then maybe eventually migrating people over to that, that's a success story, right? You can start somewhere. And enclaves are typically a good place to start. They typically aren't the final solution, though. And that's what we have found, even with working with very large enterprises. I mean, we're talking the largest one being 330,000 people, right? Multinational. They're like, we'll just do a CMMC enclave. Well, when you ask them where their export control data is, they can't give you a straight answer. You know, an enclave probably doesn't fit the bill, right? But just know that this is a constantly evolving thing. Enclave is not a permanent solution. It's a perpetual. It's the beginning of the end, if you will, right? So it's just good to really understand that, right? I want to make sure that this room is educated, right? The goal is we want to be compliant. We want to make sure that our business is successful that we're working for at this moment. And these are some of the good tools that you might take with you when you're considering doing an enclave, or maybe now, you know, not doing an enclave. So this is from some final takeaways. Identify the CUI, identify the business requirements, identify the allowable IT burden, that's a pretty big one. Identify other federal contracts that have CUI. These are the 4 main takeaways that I would highly recommend, right? Use Microsoft 365 and Purview and Azure and Office 365 to identify CUI in some of your cloud environments, right? Extend that to, you know, if you're in Google or some other sort of Dropbox or other file collaboration service, I'm sure they have very similar capabilities, right? Make sure to scan and just try to identify to then address these people that are storing or processing or transmitting this data, and then start building some of your data flow models from that. Identify the business requirements like we talked about, right? Can you actually manage duplicate ERP systems? Is there even a strong business case to have duplicate ERP systems, right? Can you somehow, you know, modify the data in a way where maybe you can sanitize it to some degree, right? Identify the allowable IT burden. This kind of goes back to, you know, make sure that the cost of running an enclave makes financial sense, right? Is your company willing to hire more people or maybe pay you a lot more? Yeah, maybe one or the other. And identify other contracts that have CUI, right? Be aware that CUI is the CUI program is a federal program, right? So this is going to extend well beyond the DoD. CMMC is the one with the whipping post right now with all the assessments coming and validation of your implementation. But that's only a matter of time, probably through the whole federal base anyways, right? This is just the tip of the spear in what we're talking about.